Good. Can you? Oh, good. You guys can hear me. I have so many microphones on me. Like, there's going to be a mic drop if I can weasel it in. So, thank you, Ian, for the introduction. And I'm super honored to be here among what I'd say my people. So it's like the D3 mailing list in real life. It's the best. So and I was really humbled to ask to come speak to you guys because I'm inspired by your work all the time, and I thought, well, what the hell am I going to do? What can I possibly talk to you about? So we'll see how this goes. But a little bit about me. I work at a company called Bocoup, where we work to move the open web forward, so through open source and doing community events and things along those lines. I work with some really amazing folks, so highly recommend just looking them up. And I've been working on something called the MISO project for several years now, which is a collection of different libraries for working with data and data visualization on the web. And I'll actually talk about one of those libraries today that has to do with D3. And as Ian mentioned, I organize OpenVisConf with my Bocoup colleagues in Boston, which is going to be incredibly amazing this year. I feel like it's my 4-year-old birthday party, and I invited all the superheroes to come, and they're coming. I don't know why, but they're going to be there, and they're going to talk about really cool stuff. So I think we've had like 15 tickets left as of this morning. So if you're interested in coming, I'd love to tell you more. But I thought, what's my place in the world? Because I give talks a lot about different technology things, and I thought, well, this is a keynote, so I should answer some more meta questions. And I realized the thing I'm really into is I'm really into patterns. So in my copious spare time, I make really bad generative art that I keep to myself. But I'm really interested in kind of the intersection of parameterizing things and then figuring out how chaos looks, parameterized chaos. And so I really love patterns. That's sort of probably something that was true since I was in school, and that's how I learned stuff, is I sort of figure out a pattern and then I go from there. And I also love architecting code. So my background is in CS and software engineering, and code architecture is really, if I can just refactor other people's code, I would be so happy all the time. And there's so much good code to refactor out there, so even better. And then last but not least, I love to teach. So I teach a D3 class at Bocoup and some other things. And fundamentally, I want to help people come to technology, whether it's from other technology or from scratch. I would love if everybody could code a little bit. And so I think I come into D3 from that perspective a little bit. And so the way that this works a lot of time is, I'm one of these little circles, and you guys are the rest. And you go ahead and write amazing D3 code, and I watch. I lurk from afar, and then I sort of see that there are these patterns. And I'm like, aha! I want to take these things and make them clear for other people. And so a little bit of my talk today is going to be about how this process worked out with one of the libraries that we had written. And so a little bit about my D3 context, because I know people work with D3 in different ways. And being a part of Bocoup and the kind of work that we end up getting has a certain pattern. So a lot of the times I work within big apps. So people who have lots of things going on the page besides D3 itself. There's lots of chart reuse. There's common chart types, and everybody wants them with a twist. But nonetheless, there's a lot of common ground there. They're mostly standard charts. Every so often there'll be something crazy someone asks for, but a lot of the times the core of D3 really covers what it is we need to build. Sometimes there's a lot of data points, and we've had to deal with optimizing performance and all sorts of questions along those lines, which is always really fun to start venturing into that realm. And all the maps, all the time. Everyone wants a choropleth or something, so I work a lot with D3 choropleths and layering choropleths on top of things. And then a lot of times the charts live in a bigger ecosystem, so there's a lot of coordination between the charts and other components. There's interactions and behaviors that I'm going to need to trigger, both from the user perspective and from the code and so on and so forth. So it's pretty exciting because it's never in a vacuum. And so I get to have to interface with other libraries and tech stacks and code patterns, so which is really fun. And so there's what I'm actually building, right? And I wanted to sort of, the pattern behind that is, I build chart A, and then I build chart A again for someone else. And then I make it again, but then it looks a little different. So maybe a little different style, maybe a layout, maybe it's a horizontal bar, not a vertical bar. And then I build chart A, but I add some new functionality B. And then I add functionality C also. And then for mobile, I need to use chart A, but not functionality B or C, so just chart A. But then for tablet, I'm going to have to add functionality B to not functionality C. And then now I have to build chart A2, which is a little bit like A, but slightly different. So, and then that happens over and over again. But there are some things that are kind of very similar across all these different charts. So it has to manage a bunch of containers, whether it's group elements or divs, whatever it is. There is some organizational structure within my chart that I try to maintain. It renders data, obviously, and I say that because you don't have to make things with D3 that are dependent on data, although most likely you do. But most of the time, that's the core reason for why we're doing what we're doing. It redraws or may need to redraw in the future. I've kind of operated on the assumption that any chart I ever write may need to update itself for whatever reason, and most of the time it's true, especially when you do live in a bigger ecosystem and user selections can cause updates. That's a pretty fair assumption. It always has scales, at least X, Y color, probably more. It needs dimensions, height, width, and margin. Most of the time I have to spend some time setting those things up. It needs to know what device it's on, whether mobile, web, or tablet. I'd like to say that responsive web solves all the things, but that's actually not true for data viz. And that's a whole separate project I'm trying to figure out now. But really, what it means to do data viz on these other devices is often something completely different. It obviously uses some visual marks, and a lot of the time different kinds. So whether I'm drawing circles with labels or squares with little pie charts, whatever it may be, there's going to be multiple kinds of marks that are used for the same data. And then it needs to capture user interactions and maybe react or rebroadcast things back up. So again, when you're doing a lot of chart coordination, you're realizing you need to be able to control other charts through something other than user behavior. And so there's a lot of that. And so then there's how we build it. And so Kai and Ian told me I can show you guys a whole ton of code. So from this point on, it's just code. So bear with me. But it's fun. It's really exciting. So I wanted to take just sort of a standard D3 chart, and maybe go over a little bit some of the patterns that I see across a lot of different charts written with D3. So this is one of Mike Bostock's blocks. And it just renders this bar chart with numbers at the top. And there's a few things that are pretty common across almost any D3 chart you pick up. So you can't really see the highlighting, but it's there. There's some dimensions that we set up. So in this case, just height and width. There are some scales that we're setting up. So here we have a Y scale. And note that it's kind of separated a little bit. So until we have data, we can't set our domain and so on and so forth. And then we set up, the base of our chart. So the container that it's going to go into. If we had other containers, maybe we would be setting those up there too. And then we sort of have a bunch of changes we need to make as a result of data showing up. So this is where maybe we'd transform the data in some way, or append different things, run it through some layouts, depending on what your chart is doing, calculate some dimensions, and then we create some visual representation of that data, right? So in this case, we're going to create the bars with the labels inside of them. But I look at it a little bit as a layer, right? I'm going to layer this thing on the chart, and maybe later down the road I want to layer something else. But then this thing breaks down even further, right? So everywhere that I bind data, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create that data binding. I wish that we could make this part so clear for people who come into D3 the first time, because the amount of times that this is the first thing I ever show anybody who's like, I want to learn D3. I'm like, sit down. Let me show you. Let me show you data joins. This isn't going to make sense. You're going to select elements and they don't exist yet. Isn't that weird? Trust me. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I know it's weird. So I've found all sorts of creative ways to do this part. But it's really important for me to call this out, right? So we have our data binding, and then we create our enter selection and presumably other selections if we had them. And then we do a bunch of stuff to that, right? So in this case, we're transforming and we're appending a couple of other elements and so on. But these are pretty common everywhere, right? So there's dimensions, there's scales, there's containers, there's calculations that happen because data is available, and a data binding, and then all our appropriate selections and transitions. and so on. And then we do this pretty much every time, right? Regardless of kind of what it is you're writing, you're gonna go over some of the same patterns. Maybe some things will change. Maybe it's a little more complicated. Maybe you're like proxying to Canvas or whatever that may be. But nonetheless, I think a lot of these stay the same. And so, especially because of the nature of my work, I have to think a lot about how do I get to make some of these patterns more reusable? How do I not write the same code over and over? And after writing a lot of D3 charts in that way, I thought, okay, well, why am I even doing it? And so, we started off with sort of the Towards Reusable Chart article and kind of first try to define what we mean by reusable charts. And to us, that means 4 different things. First, that something is repeatable. So I can very easily take my constructor of a bar chart or whatnot, and I create many of them, right, with different data, but nonetheless, they all function in the same exact way and live independently on the page. It means that it's configurable, right? So I can take, again, my bar constructor, and then when I can create it, I can customize it a little bit, right? So maybe I can change colors or orientation or so on and so forth, but nonetheless, sort of the core remains the same. And that's a little bit harder. But then it gets further to make something extensible. And this is where a lot of our work that I'll show you is started from, is how do we actually take a chart written with D3 and make it easier for somebody else, or even for me later down the road, to add on additional functionality or additional features or additional visual marks. And what that means is, I take my bar chart and then I start, adding things to it. So maybe I make it stacked, maybe I add labels or so on and so forth. But really adding that extra functionality. And then sort of the holy grail is, how do I combine charts together to sort of make the Frankenstein of charts, right? So if I have a bar chart and I have some labels, how do I merge the two while being independent of each other to create one beautiful chart baby? So we sort of try to keep these 4 things in mind. And what this culminated in is something called D3 chart, and which is one of the libraries on the MISO project. And this is where I give a big shout out to Mike Panisi, who is sort of the core maintainer and the person I work with very closely on making D3 chart amazing. And it's just like a gorgeous, beautiful piece of code. So I highly recommend looking at it just for fun. So I thought we would go through an example of how we try to sort of meet some of these requirements a little bit. And the core of D3 chart, it's funny, it's like a very meta library. It's a library for people who want to write charts. So even if there are charts written with D3 chart, we're like not aggregating them together. We're not like NVD3, which is awesome and has some charts for you to use. So we're like one level below that. And like, anybody who wants to write a collection of charts, we're here for you. So in this case, the chart we're going to write is just a circle chart. It renders circles along the x-axis based on the data coming in. So nothing too crazy. And this is the API that I want. I want to basically create my selection, give it some dimensions, and then initialize my chart, like calling .chart, and then maybe configure it. So in this case, give it the color orange. And then I want to call draw with data once or maybe twice, or every time I want to render new data, I just call draw. And I don't want to really think about it beyond that. I don't want to redefine my selections. I don't want to know what happens internally. And so to do that, I would start off by basically, so we monkey patch the chart function onto D3. And the first thing I would do is I would start the definition of my constructor for my circle chart, which has an initialize function, and then I'm putting in a placeholder for that color configuration option that I was telling you earlier. And it takes a color. And it'll function as a getter setter. So if I pass a parameter, it'll set it. If I don't, it's going to give me the current value. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up my scale instead of my initialize. So I'm just going to use the width. And then I'm going to add this transform function so that I can basically, before I draw anything, I can capture that data. And I can, set my scales or the domains of my scales and so on and so forth. And so again, just almost like a little intercept before that data passes to all my other drawing functions. And so then I'm going to go ahead and define my getter setter. So this is pretty simple. I'm saying, if I have an argument passed, then just if I don't have one, then actually let's just say if not. Then return the current fill, and if not, then just save it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a layer. So again, talking about these groups of marks, here I'm going to basically say, OK, I'm going to have some circles. And so I define a new layer. I give it a name, and I give it the element that it's going to be rendering to. So this most likely is going to be a group element if I'm an SVG, or some kind of div or whatever if I'm in just using straight up HTML5, whatever. And then I'm going to add these 3 methods that are core to defining any layer. So I'm going to show my data binding, and then I'm going to do my insert, which is what happens when I create new elements. And then I'm going to define events, and I'll talk about those a little bit when we get to it. But so the first thing is our data binding. So I'm just going to say, select all circles, bind the data, and just return that selection. And then here I'm going to say, for any time we have an element we need to draw, just append a circle, or maybe I'm going to use insert or whatnot. And then I'm going to define what we call lifecycle events. So data join selections, however you want to call them. We're calling them lifecycle events just because we sort of view them as the lifecycle of the chart. Data, elements come in, elements exit, elements update. And there's actually there's 4 of them that we define, plus 4 for every transition. So there's enter, exit, and then there's 2 more. There's one called merge and one called update. If you've ever used the actual binding data binding to set styles or anything on your elements, you've noticed that depending on where you put it, it acts differently. If you put it before your enter selection, then it'll update all the elements before the new ones that are coming in. And if you do it between your, after your enter selection, it'll update everything that's currently on the stage. So we've kind of separated those 2 into update and merge. Again, to just be a little more explicit, right? So we want people to just come in and be like, all right, I know what I want to happen on enter. I know what I want to happen on exit. I'm just going to give you the structure to do that. And so here I'm just specifying an enter. I'm going to have an exit transition, which same as an exit, but with a transition selection. And then it's just going to set our circles y and x, and it's going to use the scale over there, and then set the radius. Again, I could parameterize it, but I'm not. And then set the fill, so you can see I'm just fetching the color there. And then for transition, I'm just going to set the opacity, transition to opacity 0, and then remove the element. And so that's really it, right? So that was basically that chart in a slightly more, almost declarative, but not quite form, right? Where hopefully it's just a little bit easier to know where every single thing happens. And so let's kind of see how we're doing, right? So repeatable, it's still repeatable. So this is me instantiating both of those charts and drawing with different types of data on different selections. It's configurable because I have that color configuration parameter. I can add them as I wish. Normally I add ones for height and width and so on and so forth. So here I'm just drawing 2 with different colors. Now the extensibility part, and this is where I think it's really super powerful. So let's say what I wanted to do was draw the circle chart, but I wanted to add borders to my circles. And granted, you'd probably just do this in SVG, CSS, and that's fine. But bear with me for a minute. If I want to take all the functionality that I already have, and I just want to attach one extra piece of behavior, maybe I want to capture a new user event that I wasn't capturing before, right? I want to now add hover behavior or something. So I can basically fetch my previous chart by calling d3.chart with the name, and then call .extend and give it a new name. And then this is really cool because I can just take any layer I've previously defined, get it, and then say, OK, I want to bind to a lifecycle event. So when something enters, on that enter selection, I also want to set a style, or maybe I want to catch the mouse over, or whatever it is. But this is really all it takes from this point to recreate the chart that is then going to have the same exact API that we've had before, like these 4 lines. And I've definitely done that before when I had to add user behaviors and so on. And so but this can also be more complicated, right? So let's say I want to add now I want to add labels onto my circles for whatever reason. And I don't want to use an axis because I'm being difficult. But again, I just call extend, and then I just create a new layer inside of the initialize for this function. And it's going to propagate down. It's going to first create that chart, and then tack this other layer on top. And this should be familiar, and we sort of have access to all the same information we did in the other one. And that's pretty cool, right? So the only thing that changed is that now I'm initializing a different chart, but I still have all the API from the previous one. And now I have labels on my circles, which is pretty cool. And then last but not least, if let's say for whatever reason I have 2 different charts, I have a circle chart and then I have a label chart that just renders labels. And now I want to bring the two of them together. What I can do is I can define this new chart. Inside of initialize, I actually just instantiate two charts, and then I attach them. And what that does is it sort of binds to that same draw event loop, so that I still only initialize this one chart, but then when I call draw on it, it'll go through all the attached charts and call their draw, and then go through their layers and call their draw, and so on and so forth. So I still interface with it as if it was one single chart, which is pretty cool. And so I was going to do this code walkthrough, but I'm gonna skip it. But you guys should definitely check it out. It's github.com/mesoproject, and I'd love to talk to you guys more about it. But really all we're doing is we're just like capturing those selections and then taking your hooks and appending them on and calling them in the appropriate times, right? And so a lot of people ask me why just not like the reusable chart pattern. D3 is written this way. Like, why not just use that? And I love that pattern. It really started for me with that pattern. And I've used it on things for a really long time. But because I have to think so hard about reusability, and a lot of the components I write get taken over by other people, and, when we pass off software that we do for consulting, that like I need to make sure that this thing is very maintainable and sustainable and extendable and so on and so forth. And one of the bigger things was really like how to access these lifecycle selections. Like I really wanted to be able to add functionality to my charts without having to think about exposing those things, right? Like if I forget to expose my enter selection, and how do I organize like these different marks that are all a part of a single chart? I really wanted to make that incredibly clear and available. And then, there's still this internal question of like, how do I actually break down my graphical elements, right? So if you look at a lot of charts, there's going to be a lot of group elements, and for example, and they're all just kind of organized, just like one big long chaining effect. It reminds me sort of the early days of jQuery, where we were so excited about all the stuff we can do, and then someone said, hold on, like my file is 20,000 lines, I can't deal. And now we have like 17,000 MVC frameworks, and it's great. So like I'm happy to be a part of that. Us trying to figure out like how do we do that part better, and there's so many different approaches. So I'm thrilled to just be one of many. And then there's the question of prototypal inheritance, which there's lots of debate on. Like, does it matter? Does it not matter? But I've had to render like hundreds of charts on a page, which doesn't happen a lot, and it really sort of depends on what you need. So I just put together a super quick JS perf of two examples that actually, this first one is the one on the actual article, and then the second one is that version, but with prototypal inheritance. And there's sort of a pretty big performance hit once you're starting to get in higher numbers. And by all means, this should be graphed sort of, the number of iterations and so on. But the nice thing in the end is if you use prototypal inheritance, you're sharing the prototype. So all your functions go on the prototype. And if you're at any point like dynamically extending charts, for example, which has happened to me, like some user will enable something and I have to just go back and add some methods that maybe weren't there before, it's nicer to extend the prototype once instead of like iterating over 100 charts and extending those. So these things do add up, especially when you live in a big application environment where there's 1,000 other things happening, and everyone's sort of fighting for resources. So, and there's some extra resources there to go read about prototypal inheritance. And so where we're at, we have some charts that have been published. We're going to be rewriting our registry, because at the moment it's just like a Google form that we pull stuff from. But there's anything from choropleth to bar charts to legends. And I have about 8 or 9 charts that I'm hoping to release in maybe a month or two that are just sort of cover some bases, and also let me tackle the question of how to handle charts on mobile devices and things like that. And then I have something called D3 chart base, which is where a lot of common functionality goes. So things like handling dimensions and handling what I call modes. So being in tablet mode or mobile mode or whatever, there's some code to sort of help proxy that. And in general, it's kind of where people who come to D3 chart and go, why doesn't it do the margin convention? And I'm like, go put your issue over there, and then like we'll think about it there, because D3 chart itself is really tiny. We like to keep it that way. And we're working on a whole lot of stuff, so we're just version 03, and there's lots of place to go. We're trying to figure out how to do decorators. So a lot of the times, if you want to make sure your chart has dimensions, like you don't always want to make a chart and then extend it Maybe you just want to be able to like tack on tooltips or tack on legend or whatever. So we're trying to figure out how to spec that out, how to do chain transitions. You probably want to do like exit : transition : transition : transition. So we're figuring out how that should look. Hooking into the draw loop, a lot of people have asked us to, I want to know where my drawing is done. So we're trying to figure out how to do that while being mindful of, things being asynchronous and so on and so forth. And then, you tell me, because what I'm really here for, and I'm here to learn much more from you than you probably learned from me, is I want to know what your patterns are, because my goal is to hopefully take those and make them really clear for people who are new to D3 and who are trying to figure out how to live in this ecosystem. So to me, I think this is what this event's about, is trying to figure out maybe how to solve some of these bigger problems for other folks. So thank you.